The wind was the first and last thing you knew of this land. It was a constant, restless spirit that swept down from the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, carrying with it the grit of 1,000 barren miles. It whispered through the brittle, sun-scorched grass that carpeted the plains in an endless ocean of brown and ochre, a landscape so vast and unyielding it could swallow a man's soul whole. This was the West in the 1880s, a place of stark, brutal beauty, where the sky was a canvas of impossible blue by day and a scatter of diamond dust stars by night. But it was a beauty that demanded a price. Here, survival was not a given. It was a daily battle waged against the elements, against the loneliness, and against the silence that pressed in from all sides. The settlements were few and far between, lonely outposts of civilization clinging precariously to the edge of the wilderness, connected by the thin iron veins of the railroad. For those who lived out on the homesteads, life was a solitary prayer, a testament to human endurance carved out of dust and sweat. At the heart of one such homestead, 160 acres of hard-won soil, stood a simple log cabin. It was a sturdy, unadorned structure, built by a man's own 2 hands, its timber weathered to a silver gray by years of sun and wind. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin, lonely plume against the immense sky. This was the domain of Silas Blackwood. For 7 years, he had been its sole inhabitant, a widower bound to his land by memory and duty. Silas was a man built like the country he inhabited, tall, lean, and weathered. His face was a map of his life, etched with the lines of hard labor and quiet grief. His hands were calloused and capable, as comfortable mending a fence as they were coaxing life from the stubborn earth. But his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a distance that few ever tried to cross. 7 years ago, this cabin had echoed with the soft laughter of his wife. Sarah, she had been the light and warmth in his world, a wildflower blooming in the harshest of soils. He had loved her with a fierce, quiet intensity that was his nature. He had built this home for her, for the family they dreamed of. But that dream had turned to ash on the same day it was meant to be born. Sarah had died in childbirth, taking their infant son with her. The silence that fell over the cabin that day had never truly left. It had seeped into the very walls, into the marrow of Silas's bones. He buried them both on a small hill overlooking the creek, beneath the shade of the lone cottonwood tree. And with them, he buried a part of himself. In the years that followed, Silas became a man of routine and ritual. He rose before the sun, the chill of the morning air a familiar shock to his system. He tended to his cattle, his small herd of hardy longhorns, their lowing the only conversation he held most days. He plowed his fields, the rhythmic pull and strain of the work, a balm for his restless mind. He ate his meals alone at the long wooden table Sarah had so lovingly polished, the empty chair opposite him a constant, silent rebuke. He worked until his muscles screamed for rest, until exhaustion was a heavy blanket that could smother the memories that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. He did not seek comfort or companionship. The townsfolk in dusty Redemption, a day's ride away, knew him as a quiet, respectable man who kept to himself. They nodded to him when he came for supplies, and he would nod back, his words few and measured. They spoke of him in hushed tones, the tragic story of his wife's passing a local legend, a cautionary tale of the unforgiving nature of life out on the frontier. They saw a man hardened by loss, but they did not see the ghost that walked beside him, the echo of a gentle voice he could still hear in the sigh of the wind. Emotion, he had decided, was a luxury he could no longer afford. It was a weakness, a chink in the armor a man needed to survive out here. His heart was a fallow field, and he had no intention of ever tilling it again. The farm was his only purpose now. Maintaining it, making it prosper, was the only tribute he could pay to the woman who had believed in it, and in him. But time, like the relentless wind, wears down even the strongest stone. 7 years of solitary labor had taken their toll. The seasons blurred into one another, each marked by the same back-breaking work. Silas was no longer a young man. He felt the ache in his bones on cold mornings, the weariness that clung to him even after a night's sleep. A bad harvest one year, followed by a harsh winter that took 3 of his best cattle, brought a hard truth into sharp focus. He could not do it all alone forever. The farm was too big, the work too endless. The thought was a practical one, devoid of sentiment. He needed help. He needed a partner, not for his heart, but for his hands. One evening, while reading a week-old newspaper he'd picked up in town, his eyes fell upon an advertisement in the back pages. It was discreet, tucked away amongst notices for farm equipment and patent medicines. Asterisk, matrimonial post, asterisk. It spoke of respectable ladies from the East, women of good character seeking husbands in the West. He had heard of these mail-order brides. Most men who sent for them were looking for love, or at least the comfort of a wife. Silas was looking for neither. He was looking for a solution to a logistical problem, a woman to run the house, to tend a garden, to help with the chickens and the canning, to share the crushing weight of the daily workload. A quiet presence that would fill the empty spaces without demanding anything from the part of him that had died with Sarah. After 3 nights of staring into the fire, the newspaper clutched in his hand. He made his decision. He sat at the table and, by the light of a kerosene lamp, penned a letter. It was as sparse and direct as the man himself. Asterisk, to whom it may concern. Asterisk, I am a farmer, 35 years of age, a widower. I own 160 acres of land. It is good land, but requires hard work. I am seeking a wife. She must be of honest character, unafraid of labor, and of a quiet disposition. I can offer a sturdy home and my protection. I am not a man for poetry or idle talk. I require a partner in work. If these terms are agreeable, please reply. Asterisk, sincerely. Asterisk, asterisk, Silas Blackwood. Asterisk, asterisk, redemption. Wyoming Territory. Asterisk. He folded the letter, sealed it with a drop of wax, and felt nothing. It was a business transaction, nothing more. A necessary step to ensure the survival of the farm, the survival of Sarah's legacy. Hundreds of miles away, in the stifling, judgmental confines of a small Massachusetts town, Clara May Thompson read his letter. It had been passed to her by a woman from the matrimonial post, a woman who had looked at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. For Clara, the letter was not a business proposition. It was a lifeline thrown into a sea of despair. Clara had once known a life of modest comfort and gentle hopes. She was the daughter of a tailor, a quiet, bookish girl with a sweet smile and a reputation for kindness. She had been betrothed to the son of the town's most prominent merchant, a handsome young man who had courted her with flowers and whispered promises. Her future had seemed as bright and orderly as the neatly tended gardens of her hometown. And then, it had all been destroyed by a lie. A rejected suitor, a man with a cruel streak and a bruised ego, had sought his revenge by poisoning her name. He wove a vile, baseless tale of impropriety, a story whispered in parlors and behind cupped hands at the general store, in the rigid, unforgiving moral landscape of her community. The accusation was as good as a conviction. Her fiancé, a man of weak character and deep concern for his family's standing, had broken their engagement publicly. Her father, crushed by the shame, had turned his back on her. She was ostracized, a fallen woman in the eyes of the very people who had watched her grow up. The doors of the church, once a place of solace, were closed to her. The whispers followed her like a shadow, the stares of former friends cutting deeper than any knife. She had been left with nothing but a small inheritance from her deceased mother, a single, battered suitcase, and a scar etched not on her skin, but deep within her soul. The East, with its suffocating piety and long memories, was a prison. The West, a place she had only read about in dime novels, represented a desperate, terrifying chance at a new beginning. Silas Blackwood's letter, with its stark honesty and lack of romantic pretense, was, in its own way, a comfort. He didn't want poetry, She had no poetry left to give. He didn't want a blushing bride full of dreams. Her dreams had been scorched to cinders. He wanted a worker, a partner. He wanted someone quiet, after months of being the subject of loud, vicious gossip. The promise of quiet was the most beautiful thing she could imagine. And so, she accepted. She packed her few belongings, a couple of simple dresses, her mother's Bible, a worn copy of * Jane Eyre, and boarded a train heading west. With every clatter of the wheels on the track, she felt herself moving further away from the woman she had been, a ghost leaving her own haunting behind. The journey was long and arduous, a blur of changing landscapes and unfamiliar faces. She sat by the window, watching the neat green fields of the east give way to the sprawling, untamed wilderness of the plains, and felt a strange sense of kinship with the land. It was scarred and lonely, but it was also vast and free. Perhaps here, a person could be judged not by their past, but by the strength of their will to endure. The train finally hissed to a stop at the small, sun-bleached depot in Redemption. The name seemed like a cruel joke. Clara stepped onto the platform, her legs unsteady, clutching her suitcase. The air was dry and hot, filled with the smell of dust and coal smoke. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with rough-hewn wooden buildings. It was even smaller and starker than she had imagined. She stood there, a solitary figure in her dark traveling dress, feeling the curious stares of the few men loitering outside the saloon. Her heart hammered against her ribs. And then she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the platform, leaning against a wooden post, his arms crossed over his chest. He matched the description he had given of himself. He was tall, dressed in durable, homespun clothes, his hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He didn't move as she approached, just watched her with an unnerving stillness. The first meeting was a collision of two solitudes, wrapped in a blanket of awkward silence. Clara stopped a few feet from him, her gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of his boots. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, hoarse from the dust and disuse. He straightened up, his movements economical and deliberate. He gave a curt nod, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers for a fraction of a second before skittering away to a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Ma'am," he grunted. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Clara saw a man walled off from the world. His face was stern, almost grim, and the way he avoided her gaze felt like a judgment in itself, though she couldn't tell of what. He seemed carved from the same hard, unyielding material as the land around them. There was a profound sadness in him, a deep-seated weariness that his formidable physical presence couldn't hide. Silas, for his part, saw a woman who was nothing like he had pictured. He had expected someone plainer, perhaps, or someone whose desperation was a visible cloak. But the woman standing before him was not what he'd anticipated. She was slender, but she held herself with a straight-backed dignity that belied her apparent fragility. Her face was pale and drawn from her journey, but her features were fine, framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. There were shadows under her eyes, but the eyes themselves, a startling shade of green. He noticed in that brief, fleeting glance, held a flicker of something he couldn't name. It wasn't weakness, and it certainly wasn't submission. It was resolve, a quiet, steely strength that seemed out of place with the nervous way she clutched her luggage. He had asked for a woman of quiet disposition, and she was certainly that. But this was not the quiet of a docile nature. It was the quiet of a storm held in check. He reached for her suitcase. "This all?" "Yes," she breathed, her fingers reluctantly releasing the handle. Their hands brushed for an instant, a spark of warmth in the oppressive heat. They both recoiled as if burned. Without another word, he turned and led the way to a simple buckboard wagon hitched nearby. He tossed her suitcase into the back and moved to help her up, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air before he seemed to think better of it. Clara, sensing his hesitation, climbed up onto the hard wooden seat herself, arranging her skirts with a practiced neatness. Silas took his place beside her, the space between them feeling as wide as the plains. He snapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward, pulling the wagon out of the small town and onto a dirt track that disappeared into the vast, empty horizon. The silence in the wagon was absolute, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. They were two strangers, bound by a contract, heading toward a shared life that felt as barren and uncertain as the landscape stretching out before them. The wagon ride was the beginning of the silence. It stretched from the edge of town to the homestead, a long 3-hour journey under a brassy, unforgiving sun. Silas did not speak, his attention fixed on the horses and the road ahead. Clara, seated beside him, felt the silence as a physical weight. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the horizon, a seemingly infinite expanse of brown earth and pale blue sky. When they finally arrived at the log cabin, he simply grunted. "We're here." He helped her down, his touch brief and impersonal, and carried her suitcase inside. The interior was as stark and functional as the man himself. It consisted of one large room, meticulously clean, but devoid of any softness or decoration. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. A cooking area with an iron stove and simple shelves stood in one corner. In the other, a large, sturdy bed covered with a plain wool blanket was the only piece of furniture. A single door led to what she presumed was a small storeroom. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no sign of the woman who had lived and died here. It was a space for survival, not for living. The first days on the farm were a blur of exhaustion and aching muscles. Clara had never known such labor. Silas was a demanding, if not unkind, taskmaster. He communicated in gestures and brief, clipped sentences. "Cows need milking. Firewood stacked there. Wells that way." He showed her how to milk the cow, his large, calloused hands guiding hers for a moment before he pulled away as if scorched. He taught her how to churn butter, how to knead bread that wouldn't be as hard as a rock, and how to work the wood-fired stove without filling the cabin with smoke. She learned to collect eggs from the cantankerous hens, to mend his torn work shirts by the dim light of the evening lamp, and to draw water from the deep, cold well. He never praised her, but he never criticized either. He simply observed her work with his quiet, unreadable eyes, and if it was done to his satisfaction, he would nod and move on to the next task. He was teaching her to be a partner in work, just as his letter had promised. He was also, in every conceivable way, keeping his distance. The land itself was a relentless adversary. The fine, powdery dust of the plains was inescapable. It coated every surface, worked its way into her clothes and hair, and left a constant gritty taste in her mouth. The sun was a tyrant, beating down from a cloudless sky, leaching the color from the landscape and the energy from her body. But it was the nights that were the hardest. As the sun set, the temperature would plummet, and a profound, chilling cold would settle over the plains. The wind, which had been a hot breath during the day, became a mournful, howling beast. It rattled the window panes and shrieked around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to amplify the silence within. In those first weeks, Clara felt a loneliness so vast and crushing it threatened to break her. She was a tiny, insignificant speck in an overwhelming emptiness, 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, married to a stranger who was more a ghost than a husband. Their shared bed was a vast, empty continent between them. The first night, Silas had gestured to it and said, "You take that side." He had then turned his back to her, and she had lain down on the very edge of the mattress, her body rigid, her breathing shallow. And so it was every night. They slept in the same bed, the heat from their bodies a palpable presence in the cold air. Yet they existed in separate worlds. There was no touch, not even an accidental brushing of hands. There were no words of comfort, no gentle good nights. The space between them was a chasm of unspoken grief and mistrust, a territory neither dared to cross. The intimacy of the arrangement was a cruel mockery of her situation. She was a wife in name, sharing a bed with her husband, yet she had never felt more alone. It was during these long, silent nights that she began to notice his restlessness. Long after she had feigned sleep, her breathing even and slow, she would hear him shift. He would rise from the bed, his movements quiet and practiced, a tall shadow in the moonlight streaming through the uncurtained window. He would stand there for what felt like hours, a motionless silhouette staring out at the dark, empty plains. Sometimes, she would hear him let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound so filled with pain that it made her own heart ache in sympathy. She didn't know what demons he wrestled with in the dead of night, what memories played out before his eyes as he stared into the darkness. But she began to understand that his silence was not born of coldness alone. It was a shield, a heavy wall he had built around a wound that had never healed. One afternoon in her third week, the oppressive heat reached its zenith. The air was still and thick, shimmering above the parched earth. Clara was determined to prove her worth, to show Silas that she was not the fragile city woman he likely thought her to be. She had been tasked with tending the small vegetable garden near the cabin, a patch of earth that required constant watering to survive. She worked for hours under the blistering sun, carrying heavy buckets of water from the well, her head pounding with a dull rhythm. The world began to feel hazy at the edges, the relentless blue of the sky seeming to press down on her. She felt a wave of dizziness, and the last thing she remembered was the rough handle of the bucket slipping from her grasp before the world dissolved into blackness. She awoke to a bewildering sensation. She was being carried. Strong arms were cradling her, one securely around her back, the other beneath her knees. Her head was resting against the solid wall of a man's chest, and she could hear the frantic, heavy beat of a heart beneath her ear. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she smelled the familiar scent of earth, sweat, and wood smoke, and her eyes fluttered open. She was looking up at Silas's face, his features contorted with an expression she had never seen on him before. It wasn't anger or indifference. It was raw, naked alarm, panic. "Clara?" he said, her name a rough, unfamiliar sound on his lips. He carried her into the cabin as if she weighed nothing and gently laid her on the bed. His hands were surprisingly tender. He pushed a stray strand of damp hair from her forehead, his fingers lingering for a second too long. In that moment, the wall between them seemed to crumble. She saw not the stoic farmer, but a man, frightened and deeply concerned. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the look was gone. He saw that her eyes were open, that she was conscious, and he recoiled as if he had been caught in a deeply transgressive act. He straightened up, backing away from the bed, his face once again an unreadable mask. "Sun sickness," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of the emotion she had just witnessed. "Stay here. Drink this." He filled a dipper with cool water from the bucket by the door and placed it on the small crate beside the bed. He did not hand it to her. He did not help her sit up. He simply turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone with the echo of his touch and the thunder of her own confused heart. She lay there, sipping the water, her body trembling not from the heat, but from the bewildering intimacy of those few moments, and the swift, cold severity of his retreat. He had shown her a glimpse of the man behind the shield, only to reinforce it, thicker and stronger than before. From that day on, a subtle, unspoken shift occurred between them. The silence remained, but it was now laced with a new awareness. They began to communicate in a language of small, anonymous gestures. One evening, after Silas had worked late into the night repairing a collapsed section of fence, he returned to the cabin long after she had gone to bed. He did not light the lamp, moving through the darkness with a familiar, weary tread. On the hearth, left where the stones would keep it warm, was a bowl of thick beef stew and a piece of fresh bread. He stood there for a long time before sitting down in the dark and eating every last bite. He never mentioned it the next day, and she never asked. But every evening he worked late, A bowl would be waiting for him. In return, she would find a bucket of water already drawn and waiting by the door in the morning, or a pile of kindling neatly chopped and stacked by the stove, saving her the arduous task. They were small acts of service, offerings left at the border between their two separate worlds, acknowledgments that they were in this together, even if they had to remain apart. Clara found herself watching him more and more. She would steal glances at him from the cabin window as he worked in the fields or the corral. She watched him one afternoon as he drove new posts for a fence line, the rhythmic swing of the heavy sledgehammer a display of raw, effortless strength. The muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and coiled under his sweat-dampened shirt. The sun beat down on his uncovered head, and she saw the beads of sweat trace paths through the dust on his skin, dripping from the end of his nose. He worked with a relentless, focused energy, as if he were waging a personal war against the land, against his own thoughts. And in those stolen moments, she saw more than just a silent, grieving husband. She saw a man of immense fortitude and resilience, a man who, despite his private pain, met every day with an unwavering sense of duty. A grudging respect began to take root in her heart, a fragile seedling in the barren soil of their marriage. The change came with the storm. It had been brewing for days, the air growing thick and heavy, the sky taking on a bruised, yellowish hue. It broke late one evening with a terrifying, primal fury. The wind came first, a low moan that quickly escalated into a violent shriek. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that lashed against the cabin. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, followed by brilliant, blinding flashes of lightning that illuminated the ravaged landscape in stark, ghostly detail. The small storeroom where Silas usually slept on a narrow cot during bad weather had a leaking roof, a fact he'd forgotten to mention. As water began to drip and then pour onto his bedding, he was forced back into the main room. Clara was already awake, sitting bolt upright in the bed, her arms wrapped around her knees. The storm was a terrifying spectacle, a raw display of nature's violent power that made the sturdy cabin feel as fragile as a matchbox. "Roof's leaking in the back," Silas said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. He didn't look at her, instead moving to check the bar on the door. Another crack of thunder, closer this time, made Clara jump, a small gasp escaping her lips. He turned, and in the flickering light of another lightning flash, he saw the genuine fear in her eyes. He hesitated, then walked over to the fireplace. "No sense in just sitting in the dark," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He coaxed the dying embers back to life, adding a few small logs until a small, cheerful fire was crackling on the hearth, pushing back the menacing shadows. He didn't return to the bed. Instead, he sat down on the floor, his back against the hearthstones, seeking the small circle of warmth and light. After a moment, Clara slowly got out of bed, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, and sat on the floor on the opposite side of the fireplace. The storm raged outside, but inside, in the small bubble of firelight, a tentative truce was formed. For a long time, they just sat, watching the flames. It was Silas who spoke first. "It reminds me of the storms back in the Ohio Valley," he said, his voice quiet and reflective. "Used to scare my sister something awful. I'd tell her the thunder was just God moving his furniture around." Clara looked at him, surprised by the personal admission. "You have a sister?" He nodded. "Amelia, younger than me by 2 years, married a banker and moved to Philadelphia. We don't write much." He fell silent, his gaze lost in the fire. An impulse of courage moved through her. "I had a brother," she said softly. "Thomas, he passed from fever when we were children. He loved to collect birds' nests." Silas turned his head to look at her. Truly look at her. Perhaps for the first time, he saw the flicker of old sadness in her eyes and recognized it as a kinsman to his own. "I'm sorry," he said. and the words were simple and sincere. They talked for over an hour, the roar of the storm providing a strange, insulating privacy. They didn't speak of their deepest wounds, of Sarah, or the scandal that had driven Clara west. Instead, they spoke of the small things, the memories from before their lives had broken. He told her about his father's farm, about a favorite horse he'd had as a boy. She told him about her mother's garden, filled with roses and lavender, and the smell of her father's tailor shop, of chalk and warm wool. They were small, safe offerings, tentative steps across the no-man's land that had separated them. At one point, Silas described a mishap involving a runaway pig and the church's Sunday picnic. The story was dryly told, but the image was so absurd that a small, unexpected laugh escaped Clara's lips. The sound was like a silver bell in the quiet room. His eyes widened slightly, and then the corner of his own mouth twitched. A low, rusty chuckle rumbled in his chest, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. It was the first time they had laughed together. As the storm began to subside, its fury spent, a comfortable quiet settled between them. The wind died down to a low whisper, and the rain softened to a gentle patter on the roof. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the exhaustion of the long night was catching up to them. "You should get some sleep," Silas said, his voice soft. Clara nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She stood up and, without thinking, reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. "For the fire?" He froze under her touch, his entire body going rigid. But he didn't pull away. He simply nodded, his throat working. She returned to her side of the bed, and this time, when she lay down, the space between them didn't feel like a chasm. It felt like a possibility. Across the room, Silas remained by the dying fire, staring into the embers, long after she had fallen into a deep and peaceful sleep. For the first time, the silence in the cabin felt not like an absence, but like a quiet, waiting thing. The morning after the storm, the world felt washed clean. The air, stripped of its dust, was crisp and smelled of damp earth and sagebrush. A fragile truce, born in the flickering firelight and shared stories, lingered in the small cabin. The silence was still present, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating blanket, but a softer, more contemplative quiet. Silas found himself watching Clara as she moved about the morning chores. And for the first time, he was not just assessing her work. He was truly seeing her. He noticed the way the early morning light caught the stray strands of dark hair that had escaped her bun, framing her face in a soft halo. He noticed the determined set of her jaw as she concentrated on kneading dough, a small furrow of concentration between her brows. He saw the efficient, graceful way she moved, a quiet economy in every action that spoke of a deep, innate competence. One morning, as she stood by the stove turning bacon, a small, genuine smile touched her lips, prompted by a playful calf frolicking just outside the window. The sight of it struck Silas with an unexpected force. It was a fleeting, private moment of joy, and it transformed her face, erasing the shadows of weariness and sorrow he was accustomed to seeing there. He felt a strange, protective urge to see that smile again, an impulse so foreign and unsettling that he immediately turned away. Grabbing his hat and heading for the barn, for Clara, this newfound peace was a fragile, terrifying thing. The quiet companionship that had begun to grow between them felt like a stolen treasure, something she had no right to possess. Her past was a constant, whispering companion, reminding her that she was damaged goods, a woman living a lie under a good man's roof. She had fled the East to escape judgment, but she had carried it with her, packed away in her heart like a stone. Every time Silas looked at her with something other than cool indifference, a wave of panic would wash over her. He was a decent, honorable man. He had offered her shelter and protection when the world had offered her only scorn. What would he do if he knew the truth? What would he think of the woman who shared his home, his name, his bed. If he knew the vile things that had been said about her, the stain that clung to her reputation, she felt like an imposter, and the quiet kindness she was beginning to find here felt like a paradise she was destined to be cast out from. This burgeoning peace was more frightening than the open hostility she had left behind, because this, she knew, she could not bear to lose. The storm had done more than just clear the air. It had torn the roof clean off a small shed used for storing tools and feed. It needed to be rebuilt, a task too large for one person. "I'll need your help," Silas said to her one morning, the words sounding slightly unnatural, as if he were unaccustomed to asking for anything. "Of course," she replied simply. They worked together for 3 days under a mercifully overcast sky. It was the first time they had undertaken a major task as a team, and they fell into a rhythm that was surprisingly easy and efficient. He was the brute strength, lifting the heavy timber beams into place while she, nimble and quick, secured them, handing him tools and driving nails with a steady, practiced hand that earned a grunt of approval. The work was hard, but it was a shared hardship, and it broke down the remaining stiffness between them. He found himself explaining things to her, the way to notch a log for a perfect fit, the reason for bracing a wall against the prevailing wind. She, in turn, asked questions, her interest genuine, her intelligence sharp. On the second day, as they worked to hoist a heavy ridgepole into place, the timber slipped. Silas grunted with the effort of holding it, his muscles straining, without a word. Clara grabbed a spare piece of lumber and wedged it underneath, creating a brace. "There!" she panted, her face flushed with exertion. Silas looked down at her, a glimmer of admiration in his stormy eyes. "Quick thinking," he said. A small, shared smile passed between them. The work, the sweat, the common goal had forged a new kind of connection. They talked more freely than they ever had, their conversation punctuated by the rhythmic thud of the hammer, and for the first time, they laughed. A squirrel, chattering indignantly at them from a nearby tree, sent Clara into a fit of giggles, a sound so bright and clear it seemed to hang in the air. Silas watched her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his own face. Later, as she passed him a hammer, her hand brushed against his. It was a fleeting touch, skin against skin, but it sent a jolt through them both, as potent and startling as a lightning strike. Their eyes met for a long, charged moment. The air crackled with a sudden, unspoken tension. Clara was the first to look away, her cheeks burning, but the memory of that touch lingered, a warm brand on her skin. That evening, the cabin felt smaller, the air thicker. They ate their dinner in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with 1,000 unsaid things. The easy camaraderie of the day had evaporated, replaced by a tense, vibrating awareness of each other. A few days later, Silas returned to the cabin in the middle of the afternoon to fetch a tool he had forgotten. He entered quietly and stopped dead in his tracks. Clara was sitting at the table, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In her hands, she clutched a worn, yellowed letter. He stood in the doorway, frozen, a witness to a private grief he had no right to see. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to comfort her, but he was a man who had forgotten the language of solace. To intrude felt like a violation. What could he say? What could he possibly do? A raw, unfamiliar anger surged through him, anger at whatever pain that letter held, at the unknown person who had caused her such sorrow. He felt a powerful, primitive need to protect her from it, and a frustrating helplessness at his inability to do so. He backed away as silently as he had come, his heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. He did not sleep that night, his mind replaying the image of her shaking shoulders over and over. Her silent tears were louder than any storm. He began to watch her with a new, heightened intensity. He was no longer just seeing her. He was studying her, trying to decipher the secrets she held locked behind her guarded green eyes. He saw the way she would sometimes pause in her work, and stare out at the horizon, a look of profound, aching loneliness on her face. He saw the faint tremor in her hands when a rider passed on the distant trail, a flicker of fear, as if she expected to be recognized, to be found. The next day, while mending a fence on the far side of the pasture, he came across a patch of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets, a riot of color in the sea of brown grass. On impulse, he dismounted and gathered a handful. It was a clumsy, awkward bouquet. He rode back to the cabin, feeling foolish, the flowers clutched in his fist. He left them in a tin can filled with water on the doorstep, then retreated to the barn like a schoolboy, his heart pounding. He watched from the shadows as she opened the door and saw them. She stopped, her body going still. She looked around, her gaze scanning the empty yard, before slowly bending down to pick them up. She brought the flowers to her face, her eyes closing as she inhaled their faint, sweet scent. When she looked up again, her eyes were shining with unshed tears. Silas felt his own throat tighten. Clara carried the wildflowers inside as if they were precious jewels. She arranged them in a glass jar and set them in the center of the table, a beacon of impossible beauty in the Spartan room. The gesture moved her more than she could say, but it also terrified her. Kindness was a currency she no longer trusted. She had learned the hard way that it often came with a price, a silent expectation she could never meet. Why was he doing this? What did he want from her? Suspicion, the bitter fruit of her past, warred with the desperate, hopeful gratitude that was blooming in her heart. Was this a genuine act of tenderness, or was it the prelude to a demand, a claim he was finally ready to make on the wife he had purchased? The flowers were a beautiful, painful question mark sitting in the middle of their life. That night, her troubled mind dragged her back to the source of her pain. She dreamt she was back in Massachusetts, standing in the town square. But the square was a courtroom, and the faces in the crowd were the familiar, unforgiving faces of her former neighbors. Presiding over it all was him, Elijah Cole, the man whose vanity and spite had destroyed her life. In the dream, his voice boomed across the square, repeating the lies, his words twisting into snakes that slithered towards her. The crowd murmured, their whispers growing into a roar of condemnation. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but her throat was closed. No sound would come out. She was trapped, suffocating under the weight of their judgment. She awoke with a strangled cry, bolting upright in bed, her body drenched in a cold sweat, tears streaming down her face. She was gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape. The dream was so vivid, so real, that for a terrifying moment she thought she was still there. Across the bed, Silas lay perfectly still, his back to her, but he was not asleep. He had been woken by her first soft whimper. He had heard the muffled sobs, the terrified gasp as she broke free from the nightmare. His entire body was rigid, every muscle tensed. He wanted to turn, to reach for her, to pull her into his arms and tell her she was safe. He wanted to demand the name of the man who haunted her dreams so he could hunt him down. But he did not move. He lay there, feigning sleep, listening to her ragged, painful breaths slowly even out. He sensed that his comfort would be an intrusion, that her terror was a private chamber he had not yet earned the right to enter. To acknowledge her fear would be to force her to name it, and he would not do that to her. So he remained silent, a helpless guardian in the dark, the sound of her weeping scarring itself onto his heart. They continued to sleep on opposite sides of the bed, a strip of cold linen marking the border between them. But the border was no longer a peaceful frontier. It was a charged, electric line. The space, once a symbol of their distance, now felt taut with unspoken tension, with the ghost of a touch, with the memory of shared laughter and the echo of silent tears. Every night, lying in the dark, every rustle of the sheets, every soft breath was magnified 100-fold. The air in the cabin was thick with their awareness of each other, a palpable, living thing that thrummed between them. The physical distance he had so carefully cultivated had somehow transformed into a source of excruciating, magnetic pull. One night, long after Clara's breathing had deepened into sleep, Silas lay awake, staring at the moonlit ceiling. The question he had been avoiding for weeks finally rose to the surface, demanding an answer. When he had written that letter, his needs had been simple, practical. He needed a housekeeper, a farmhand, a partner in work. He had built walls around his heart so high and thick he had thought them impenetrable. But this woman, this quiet, resilient woman with sad eyes and a rare, startling smile, had slipped through the cracks. She had breached his defenses without even trying, simply by being herself. He no longer looked at her and saw a solution to a problem. He saw a woman whose strength humbled him, whose sorrow enraged him, and whose presence in his house was becoming as essential to him as the air he breathed. He closed his eyes, the truth of it settling into his bones with a terrifying, undeniable weight. What did he want from her? The question echoed in the silent, lonely chambers of his heart. Did he want a wife? Or had he, against all odds, all reason, and all his broken promises to the past, finally found a woman he wanted to love? The question that had taken root in Silas's heart refused to be ignored. It followed him through the long days of labor, a constant, nagging whisper in the back of his mind. Asterisk, what do you want from her? He watched Clara, searching for a sign, a clue to the nature of the feelings she kept so carefully hidden. He saw gratitude in her eyes. He saw the quiet respect of a partner. He even saw a burgeoning affection. But was it more? Was the warmth he sometimes saw directed at him born of duty, or of something deeper, something akin to the powerful, unsettling current that was pulling him under? He was a stranger to the subtle art of courtship, a man who had only ever known a love that was simple, declared, and returned without question. This delicate, unspoken dance of glances and gestures was foreign territory, and he was terrified of taking a clumsy step that would send her fleeing. He could not bring himself to ask her directly. The words would be like stones in his mouth, heavy and artless. He feared his directness would shatter the fragile trust they had built, forcing her into a corner, compelling a polite lie or a frightened retreat. Sarah had been an open book. Clara was a carefully worded letter, written in a language he was only just beginning to learn. He needed to know the truth of her heart, but he needed to learn it in a way that would not risk her own. And so, a desperate, uncharacteristic idea began to form in his mind. It was a ploy, a deception, and it went against the grain of his honest nature, but it felt like the only way. He would remove the wall between them, the physical one, at least, and see what she would do. He rode into Redemption that Saturday on the pretense of buying feed. He sold a few of his calf hides, spoke briefly with the blacksmith about a new plowshare, and then, with a sense of grim purpose, he pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The place was noisy and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. He was not a drinking man. He'd had perhaps a dozen glasses of whiskey in his entire life. He ordered one now, nursing it at the far end of the bar, ignoring the curious looks from the other patrons. The fiery liquid burned a trail down his throat. It did little to calm the tremor in his hands. He finished the glass, paid the bartender, and left. He needed the scent of it on his breath, the slight unsteadiness it might lend his gait, just enough to make his ruse believable. The entire ride home, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. He was not just testing her, he was laying his own vulnerable, foolish heart bare, betting everything on the actions of a quiet woman in the dark. When he reached the cabin, he made a show of stumbling as he dismounted, letting the saddlebags drop to the ground with a heavy thud. He pushed the cabin door open with more force than necessary, letting it bang against the wall. Clara looked up from the table where she was mending a shirt, her eyes wide with alarm.
"Silas?"
she asked, a note of concern in her voice. "Long day," he slurred, keeping his face turned away from her, hoping the shadows would hide the truth in his eyes. He didn't trust himself to speak more. He kicked off his boots, unbuckled his gun belt, and let it fall to a chair. And then, without so much as another glance in her direction, he crossed to the bed and fell upon it. He didn't roll to his side as he always did. He lay flat on his back, directly in the middle of the mattress, a deliberate, blatant occupation of the neutral territory that had defined their marriage. He threw one arm over his eyes, and with every ounce of willpower he possessed, he forced his body to go limp, his breathing to deepen into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. And then he waited. The silence that descended was absolute. He could hear the frantic beating of his own heart, so loud he was certain she must be able to hear it too. He heard the soft scratch of her needle against fabric as she resumed her sewing, but the rhythm was hesitant, distracted. The minutes stretched into an eternity. He focused on the sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the ticking of the small mantel clock he'd inherited from his mother, the mournful sigh of the wind outside. Each sound was a marker in the agonizing passage of time. He felt her gaze on him, a palpable weight on his skin. What was she thinking? Was she angry at his intrusion, disgusted by his apparent drunkenness, or was she simply waiting for him to move? Finally, he heard her set her sewing aside, the soft rustle of her dress, the quiet scrape of her chair against the wooden floor. Her footsteps were light, almost inaudible, as she moved about the cabin, performing her nightly rituals of banking the fire and barring the door. His entire body was a tightly coiled spring, every nerve ending alive and screaming. Then, he heard her approach the bed. He could feel her presence looming over him, a subtle shift in the air, the faint scent of soap and lavender from her skin. She did not move. She just stood there, waiting, watching. The suspense was a physical torture, a hot poker against his soul. He had never felt so exposed, so utterly vulnerable. In his life, he risked everything on this moment, on this silent, shadowed judgment. After what felt like a lifetime, he felt a touch. It was so light, so hesitant. It was barely there at all, the ghost of a touch on the rough fabric of his shirt, directly over his heart. He fought the urge to flinch, the instinct to stop breathing. Her fingers rested there for a moment, a small patch of warmth that seemed to burn straight through to his skin. He felt more than heard her lean closer, the warmth of her breath ghosting across his cheek. And then she spoke, her voice a broken, fragile whisper, meant only for the ears of a sleeping man. "Oh, Silas," she breathed, the sound thick with a sorrow that lanced through him. "You are a good and decent man. You deserved a peaceful life, not a shadow like me to trouble your sleep." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. A shadow? That's how she saw herself? Not as a partner, not as a woman, but as a burden, an unwelcome ghost in his life. His heart, which had been pounding with nervous anticipation, now felt as if it were being squeezed in a vice. He had wanted to know what was in her heart, and she had shown him a deep, profound sense of her own unworthiness. Before he could process the pain of her words, he felt her shift again. Her hair brushed against his temple, and then an impossible softness, a gentle, trembling pressure, touched his lips. It was a kiss. It was chaste, fleeting, as light as a moth's wing. Yet it set his entire body on fire. It was a kiss of reverence, of apology, of a deep and hopeless affection. It was the tenderest, most heartbreaking thing he had ever felt. Every instinct in him roared to life, urging him to open his eyes, to wrap his arms around her, to pull her down to him, and answer that desperate, gentle kiss with all the pent-up longing in his own soul. But he remained motionless, a statue of stone, the feeling of her lips a searing brand on his mouth. He heard her pull back with a soft, hitching breath. The warmth was gone. He heard the rustle of her dress as she turned away, and he thought it was over. The test was done, the answer given, as devastating as it was clear. But then he heard her footsteps return. He felt the weight of the quilt as she gently pulled it up over his chest. He had expected her to retreat to a chair, to spend the night away from him. But instead, she was tending to his comfort. And then, her hand, warm and soft, cupped his cheek. It did not pull away. It lingered. Her thumb stroked the rough stubble along his jawline with an infinite, heartbreaking tenderness. It was a touch that spoke of a deep and painful longing. A quiet caress filled with all the things she would never allow herself to say. It was not the touch of a servant, nor of a grateful ward. It was the touch of a woman who felt for the man beside her. In that single, lingering touch, he felt a universe of unspoken need, of quiet adoration, of a profound and lonely ache that mirrored his own. He felt a single hot drop of moisture fall onto his temple. A tear. He heard a choked, almost inaudible sob, and then the warmth of her hand was gone. He heard her move to the very edge of the bed, the ropes groaning softly as she lay down, as far away from him as she could possibly get. He lay there in the darkness, his body rigid, his skin burning where she had touched him. He was no longer acting. The stillness that held him now was not a pretense, but the paralysis of a man who had just had his entire world broken open and remade. He had his answer, and it was more beautiful and more painful than anything he could have ever imagined. The first gray light of dawn crept into the cabin, finding Silas exactly where he had been all night, his eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. He had not slept. Clara began to stir, and he quickly shut his eyes. Resuming his charade one last time, he heard her rise quietly, dressing in the dim light, moving with a practiced stealth so as not to wake him. He waited until he heard her outside, her footsteps heading towards the chicken coop, before he finally allowed himself to move. He sat up, his body stiff, his mind a chaotic whirl of emotion. When she returned, he was dressed and stoking the fire, his back to her. "Morning," he grunted, his voice rough. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice quiet and strained. "I'll start the coffee." They moved around each other in the small space like two celestial bodies locked in a new, unfamiliar orbit. The silence was back, but it was a different beast entirely. It was no longer a space of emptiness or quiet grief. It was a living, breathing entity, charged with the memory of the night before. It hummed with unspoken words, with the ghost of a kiss and the phantom feel of a tear. They did not look at each other. They could not. To meet her eyes would be to confess that he knew, and to have him look at her would be to die of shame. They spent the entire day working side by side, repairing the section of fence that bordered the creek. They passed the hammer back and forth. They held the posts steady for each other, their hands brushing, their shoulders bumping. Each accidental touch was a jolt of electricity, a silent, deafening explosion in the quiet air. They spoke only when necessary, their words clipped and functional. "Hold this. The wire stretcher, that's good." But beneath the surface of the mundane work, a powerful, invisible current flowed between them. It was in the way he watched her hands, in the way she was hyper-aware of his proximity, in the stolen glances when the other wasn't looking. They were two separate people working on a single fence, yet they had never been more connected, more intensely, painfully, and wonderfully aware of one another. The wall between them had not just been breached, it had been obliterated, and in its place was a fragile, terrifying, and breathtaking new world. The night of the feigned drunkenness had irrevocably altered the landscape between them. The silence that had once been a barrier was now a vessel, filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. For Silas, the knowledge of Clara's secret affection was a fire in his blood, thawing the last of the icy grief that had encased his heart for 7 years. He was no longer content to live beside her in quiet partnership. He wanted to live with her. The decision was made, and with the simple, direct resolve that defined him, he began to act. He started to seek her out, creating reasons to be near. He would linger in the cabin over his morning coffee, a thing he had never done, and ask her about her plans for the garden. He began appearing at the cabin door in the middle of the day, claiming he needed a tool from the storeroom or a drink of water, when really he just needed to see the turn of her head, the quiet surprise in her eyes. One evening, he found her struggling with a heavy pot of stew. Without a word, he came up behind her, his hands covering hers on the handle, and helped her lift it from the stove. The heat from his body, the rough calluses of his hands against her skin, sent a shock wave through her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping away as soon as the pot was settled, her cheeks on fire. Silas just nodded, but a small, slow smile touched his lips as he watched her. He tried to talk to her, his attempts clumsy but earnest. He would tell her about the cattle, about the hawk he'd seen circling the south pasture, about the coming change in the weather. The conversations were stilted at first, but Clara, despite her inner turmoil, found herself responding. She would tell him about the book she was reading, or a recipe she wanted to try. Once, while describing a particularly stubborn hen, she made a witty, dry remark that caused him to let out a short, surprised laugh. The sound made her heart leap, and she looked down at her hands, flustered and pleased. He saw her blush, and the corner of his mouth tilted up in that rare, gentle smile that made her feel both cherished and terrified. With every kind word, every shared smile, every small gesture of help, Clara's sense of guilt intensified until it was a constant, physical ache in her chest. This gentle, thoughtful man was not the cold, distant stranger she had agreed to marry. This man was making a space for her not just in his home, but in his life, and she was a fraud. She was living under his roof, bearing his name, and accepting his growing tenderness, all while hiding the ugly truth of her past. She felt the shame of it like a brand. He deserved a whole woman, a good woman with an untarnished name, not a cast-off with a reputation in tatters. The kinder he became, the more certain she was that she was unworthy of him. The chasm between the woman he was beginning to see and the woman she believed herself to be grew wider with each passing day. She was living on borrowed time, and she knew, with a dreadful certainty, that it was only a matter of time before her past caught up with her and destroyed the fragile peace she had found. The day of the monthly market fair in Redemption arrived, bright and clear. It was a social occasion as much as a commercial one, a time for the scattered homesteaders to gather, trade goods, and catch up on news. "We should go," Silas had said, his tone casual, but it was the first time he had suggested they do anything together that wasn't work. "We need flour and salt." Clara agreed with a sense of both excitement and dread. Part of her yearned for the simple pleasure of it, to walk beside him in the sunshine and feel, for a few hours, like a real wife. But the other part of her, the fearful, haunted part, shrank from the idea of the crowds, the prying eyes, the possibility of the unknown. Still, she put on her best dress, a simple gray calico, and allowed Silas to help her up into the wagon. The town was bustling with energy. Farmers' wagons lined the main street, their beds filled with produce, chickens in crates, and handcrafted goods. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, bargaining, and the music from a lone fiddle player outside the saloon. For the first hour, Clara's anxieties began to melt away. Silas stayed close to her side, his presence a solid, reassuring barrier against the press of the crowd. He bought her a paper cone of roasted peanuts and pointed out the prize-winning livestock. They spoke with the blacksmith's wife, a kindly woman who smiled warmly at Clara, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of belonging. They almost felt normal. They almost felt happy. It was as they were standing by the general store, Silas inspecting a display of new axes, that her carefully constructed world came crashing down. "Well, I'll be," a man's voice drawled from behind them, a voice that was oily and sickeningly familiar. "Clara May Thompson. I never thought I'd see you this far west." Clara froze, the blood draining from her face. She would have known that voice anywhere. It was the sound of her nightmares. She turned slowly, her heart seizing in her chest. There, leaning against a post, was Elijah Cole. He was dressed in a fancy Eastern suit that looked out of place in the dusty Wyoming town, a smug, cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was the man who had courted her, been rejected by her, and then systematically destroyed her life with his poisonous lies. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Business," he said, his eyes raking over her before dismissing her and landing on Silas. "And who is this fine specimen? Don't tell me you found some poor sod out here in the dirt to take you in, after what happened back home." Silas straightened up, his hand moving to rest instinctively on Clara's arm. He looked from Elijah's sneering face to Clara's ashen one, and his own expression hardened into granite. "This is my wife, Mrs. Blackwood," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And you are?" Elijah let out a short, derisive laugh. "His wife? Oh, that is Rich. Sir, you have my deepest sympathies. Did she tell you why she had to flee Massachusetts with her tail between her legs? Did she mention the scandal about her moral failings?" He said the words loudly, pitching his voice to Carrie. Heads began to turn. The cheerful market day chatter began to die down, replaced by curious, avid whispers. "That's enough," Silas said, stepping in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. But Elijah was enjoying his audience. "This woman," he declared, pointing a finger at Clara, "it's of low character. She was cast out of our church. Her own father turned his back on her. No decent man in our town would have her. Seems you're not so particular out here in the wilderness." Every word was a nail being driven into Clara's soul. The stares of the townspeople felt like physical blows. She saw the whispers, the pointing fingers, the looks of shock and condemnation. It was happening all over again. The nightmare was real. She couldn't breathe. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Without a conscious thought, she turned and fled. She pushed her way through the gawking crowd, ignoring Silas's sharp call of her name. All she could hear was the roar of blood in her ears and Elijah's mocking laughter echoing behind her. She ran to the wagon, untied the horses with fumbling, panicked hands, and scrambled onto the seat. She whipped the reins, and the horses, startled, bolted down the street and out of town, leaving Silas, her shame, and her shattered life behind in the dust. The ride back to the farm was a blind, tear-soaked blur. She drove the horses relentlessly, her mind a maelstrom of horror and despair. She had tainted him. She had brought her disgrace to his doorstep, humiliated him in front of his neighbors. The fragile peace they had built was a lie, and now it was utterly destroyed. There was only one thing she could do. She had to disappear. She had to erase herself from his life before her stain spread any further. When she reached the cabin, she burst through the door and went straight to the bed, pulling her old, battered suitcase from underneath it. Her movements were frantic, clumsy. She threw her few belongings inside, her dresses, her book, the Bible. She did not stop to fold them. She did not stop to think. Her only impulse was to run, to get away before he came back, before he could look at her with the disgust and contempt she was sure she would see in his eyes. She was just fastening the clasps on the suitcase when the cabin door opened. Silas filled the doorway, his chest heaving from running. He must have gotten a ride from someone. His face was a thunderous mask of unreadable emotion. He looked at her, then at the packed suitcase on the bed, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. Clara flinched, expecting an explosion of anger, but he said nothing. He just stood there, his stormy eyes boring into her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, unable to bear it. She grabbed her suitcase and made a move for the door. He blocked her path. "Let me go, Silas," she pleaded, her voice cracking, tears streaming freely down her face. "Please, I won't bring you any more shame." "Shame?" He finally spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "The only shame I saw today was that of a coward who speaks ill of a woman in a crowd." He didn't move. Where will you go?" "I don't know. It doesn't matter. Anywhere but here." She tried to push past him, but he was an immovable wall. Panicked, she broke away and ran out the back door, heading for the only other place of refuge she could think of. She fled to the barn, the scent of hay and horses a small, familiar comfort in her terror. She sank down onto a pile of hay in an empty stall, buried her face in her hands, and let the great shuddering sobs she had been holding back consume her. A few moments later, his heavy footsteps followed her in. He stopped at the entrance to the stall, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. He stood there for a long time, watching her cry, letting her grief pour out. When her sobs finally began to subside into ragged, hiccuping breaths, he walked in and knelt in the straw in front of her. "Clara," he said, his voice soft, stripped of all its earlier anger. "Tell me." And she did. The story she had kept locked away for so long came tumbling out, a torrent of pain and humiliation. She told him everything about Elijah's advances, her rejection of him, and the calculated, vicious lies he had spread in revenge. She told him about the broken engagement, the whispers that followed her everywhere, the way old friends would cross the street to avoid her. She told him of being shunned by the church, of her own father's cold, unforgiving eyes. She confessed her deepest fears, that she was sullied, worthless, a fallen woman who deserved her fate. And finally, looking up at him through her tear-filled eyes, she whispered the heart of her terror. "I was so afraid," she choked out. "So afraid that you would find out, and you would send me away too, that you would look at me with that same disgust. I couldn't bear it. Silas, not from you." He listened to it all without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. The hardness was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, aching empathy. When she was finally finished, her confession hanging in the dusty air between them, he slowly reached out his hands. He didn't touch her face or her hair. He gently took her work-roughened hands in his own, holding them firmly. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He leaned closer, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I knew. Not the details, not the name, but I knew there was a deep hurt in you from the moment you stepped off that train. I saw it in your eyes." She stared at him, bewildered, her tears momentarily forgotten. He squeezed her hands. "I heard it in your nightmares. I felt it that night, when you thought I was sleeping." Her breath hitched, her eyes widening in shock. But he continued, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "And not for one single second. Clara, not once did it ever make me think less of you. It only ever made me wonder who could have been cruel enough to hurt a woman with so much strength and goodness in her." Her whole body trembled. He knew. He had known. And then he did something that changed everything. He released her hands, and with a tenderness that shattered the last of her defenses, he reached up and cupped her face. He drew her forward, and for the very first time, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a firm, solid embrace. He held her tightly against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head, pressing her face into his shoulder. It was not an embrace of passion, but of pure, unconditional acceptance. It was an embrace that said, *, you are safe, *. An embrace that said, *, you are home, *. She was rigid for a moment, shocked by the contact, and then, with a final, shuddering sob, she collapsed against him, her body going limp in his arms. She wrapped her own arms around his strong back, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had crumbled around her. He simply held her, stroking her hair, letting the warmth and strength of his body absorb her pain, her fear, and her shame, until there was nothing left but the quiet, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. They walked back from the barn as the sun began to set, painting the vast sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet. Silas still held her hand, his large, warm palm completely enveloping hers. It was a simple, possessive gesture that anchored her to the earth, a silent declaration that she was his and he would not let her go. The shame that had clung to her for so long had been burned away by the heat of his acceptance, leaving in its place a clean, quiet space where something new and fragile could begin to grow. The cabin, which had once been a mere shelter, now looked like a home, its windows glowing with a welcoming light in the encroaching dusk. Inside, the silence returned. But it was a different silence altogether. It was not the cold, empty silence of two strangers, nor the charged, tense silence of unspoken desire. This was a silence of profound, peaceful intimacy, the kind that exists between two people who have no more need for walls. They ate their supper, their eyes meeting often across the small table. Each glance was a conversation, a reaffirmation of the truth that had been spoken in the barn. I see you, I know you, I choose you. After they had cleared the table, a nervous, expectant energy began to build in the small room. The bed, once a symbol of their division, now stood as a silent, waiting promise. For so long, it had been a continent of cold linen between them. Tonight, it was an island, a sanctuary they could finally share. Silas moved to the fireplace, ostensibly to tend the fire, but she saw the tension in the set of his shoulders. He was giving her space, letting her set the pace, a gesture of respect that made her heart swell. Her fear was gone, replaced by a courage she didn't know she possessed. It was a courage born not of bravery, but of love. She had spent months sleeping beside this man, aching for him with a silent, hopeless longing. Tonight, there was nothing to hold her back, with her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. She crossed the room and stood before him. He turned from the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, his stormy eyes searching hers. She gave him a small, tremulous smile, and then, holding his gaze, she walked to the bed. She did not get under the covers. She simply sat on the edge of her side, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. It was an invitation, an act of complete and total trust. After a moment, Silas moved from the hearth and sat on his own side, the ropes of the bed groaning under his weight. He did not touch her. He just looked at her, his expression one of awe and a deep, wrenching tenderness. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. That was all it took. She turned to him, and he met her halfway. He didn't pull her or grab her. He simply opened his arms, and she went into them as if she had been born to be there. He sat up, drawing her onto his lap, and his mouth found hers. The kiss was not gentle or hesitant like the one she had stolen in the dark. This was a kiss of desperate, long-awaited homecoming. It was the parched earth finally receiving rain, the starving man given bread. It was a raw, bruising, and beautiful expression of all the weeks of silent observation, of repressed desire, of unspoken comfort, and of shared, lonely pain. His hands, which she had only ever known to be rough with work, were now impossibly tender as they tangled in her hair, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck. Hers, in turn, came up to cup his face, her fingers exploring the rough stubble on his cheeks. The stern line of his mouth now softened with passion. Words were whispered, broken and incoherent, between deep, searching kisses. Names sighed into the space between them. Apologies for the long wait, promises for the future. "Silas, Clara, I thought I'd never—" "Always you." He laid her back against the pillows, his body covering hers. A welcome, solid weight. There was no shame, no fear, only a profound sense of rightness, of two halves of a soul finally clicking into place. Their bodies, like their hearts, found each other with an instinct that felt as old as the mountains. It was a slow, tender discovery, a mapping of scars both seen and unseen, a silent vow to cherish and protect, for Clara, who had been made to feel unclean. His touch was a benediction, a holy absolution that washed away the last vestiges of Elijah Cole's poison. For Silas, who had believed his heart was a barren field, her response was a miracle of spring, a vibrant, impossible bloom in the dust. They moved together not in a frenzy of passion, but with the deep, powerful rhythm of a tide that had finally been allowed to come in, a force of nature that could no longer be denied. Later, they lay tangled in the sheets, the fire burning down to glowing embers, the moonlight painting a silver stripe across the floor. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her ear pressed against the slow, steady beat of his heart. His arm was wrapped securely around her, his fingers idly stroking her hair. The silence was back, but now it was a rich, contented thing, full of warmth and peace. For the first time in her adult life, Clara felt like she truly belonged somewhere. This feeling had nothing to do with a house, a town, or a respectable name. It was the profound, unshakable knowledge that she was known, fully and completely, by the man beside her. And she was loved not in spite of her broken pieces, but for the person they had made her. She was not a wife of convenience. She was not a shadow in a good man's house. She was Silas's wife, and she was finally, blessedly, home, their private world. However, could not remain untouched. The whispers that had started at the market fair in Redemption did not die down. They festered in a small, isolated community. Gossip was a currency, and a scandal was a feast. When Silas and Clara rode into town for supplies the following week, they were met with a wall of cold shoulders and hostile stares. Women who had previously offered a polite nod now turned away, gathering their skirts as if Clara's very presence might contaminate them. Men at the general store fell silent when Silas entered, watching him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The open hostility was a shock, but the anonymous letter that appeared a few days later was a violation. It was tucked into the handle of their milk can, a piece of folded paper, unsigned. Silas opened it, his face grim. The words inside, written in a spidery, hateful script, were blunt and cruel. Asterisk. It is a disgrace to this community that you keep a fallen woman under your roof. God does not look kindly on those who lie with the unclean. Cast out the harlot before she brings ruin down on us all. Silas crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles white, a low snarl escaping his lips. He threw it into the fire, his entire body radiating a protective fury that was both terrifying and beautiful to Clara. "Let them talk," he said, his voice like flint. "They are small people with small lives. They don't matter." But they did matter. A week later, Reverend Miller came to call. He was a tall, thin man with a stern face and eyes that seemed to see sin in every shadow. He refused Clara's offer of water, choosing to stand in the center of their cabin like a grim, avenging angel. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I have come on a grave matter. The town is in an uproar. I have been informed of the circumstances of your wife's past." "Then you've been informed of lies," Silas said flatly, standing beside Clara, his arm protectively around her waist. "Be that as it may," the Reverend continued, waving a dismissive hand. "The reputation of it is what matters. It causes a stain upon our community. It is an affront to the decent, God-fearing families of my congregation. My wife is more decent and God-fearing than any gossip who spreads poison in your pews," Silas retorted, his voice dangerously low. Reverend Miller's face tightened. "Your personal feelings are irrelevant. As your spiritual guide, I am here to counsel you to do the right thing. You must send this woman away, for the good of your own soul, and for the moral health of this town." Clara flinched, but Silas's arm held her firm. "No," Silas said. The word was absolute. The Reverend's eyes narrowed. He decided to use his most powerful weapon. "Think of the future, man. Think of your children. An unbaptized child cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. I tell you now, as God is my witness. So long as you are married to this woman, I will not perform the rite of baptism for any child born under this roof. They will be marked by their mother's sin, cast out from the grace of God, just as she was. It was a cruel, devastating threat. The color drained from Clara's face. To condemn an innocent child, to deny them a place in the church and in heaven, was the most vicious blow he could have landed. But Silas did not falter. His face, which had been angry, became eerily calm. "Reverend," he said, his voice quiet but steely, "you will be at the church tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. We will finish this conversation there." It was not a request. It was a command. Before the stunned preacher could reply, Silas opened the door. A clear dismissal. The next morning, they rode to the church. It was a weekday, and the building was empty. Sunlight streaming through the plain glass windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Reverend Miller was waiting for them at the pulpit, his Bible open before him, as if preparing for a sermon or an inquisition. Silas and Clara walked down the central aisle, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. They stopped at the front pew, and Silas turned to face the preacher. Clara stood just behind him, her hand gripping a handful of his coat at his back, drawing strength from his unwavering resolve. "You wish to speak of God's grace, Reverend," Silas began, his voice clear and steady, filling the empty church. "So let us speak of it, here, in his house." "I have already spoken my piece," the Reverend said stiffly. "The word of God is clear on the matter of adulterous women." "Is it?" Silas took a step forward. "Is the word of God also clear on the matter of bearing false witness? Is it clear on the sin of pride, of casting judgment on others lest you be judged yourself? You speak to me of my wife's reputation, a reputation destroyed by the lies of a wicked man. And you, a man of God, choose to believe the lie over the person. You choose the word of a sinner over the evidence of a good and honorable woman who has worked harder and shown more Christian charity in the few months she has been here than I have seen from your congregation in 7 years. The Reverend sputtered. "The appearance of sin must be avoided at all costs." "No," Silas cut him off, his voice ringing with conviction. "Hypocrisy must be avoided at all costs. You stand in this house built to honor a God of forgiveness, and you preach hatred. You threaten the soul of an unborn child to punish a woman you have already condemned without a trial. That is not God's work. Reverend, that is the work of a Pharisee. It is the work of a coward." He took another step, standing directly before the pulpit now, forcing the taller man to look down at him. "My wife is the best thing that has ever happened to this broken man, in this broken house. She is my grace, and if your God, the God you preach of, would deny salvation to my child because I love and honor my wife, then your God is too small. He is not the God I will worship." He held the Reverend's furious, shocked gaze. "So you may keep your threats, you may keep your judgment, and you may keep your church. If this is what it stands for, I choose love, I choose justice, I choose my wife." With that, he turned his back on the speechless preacher. He reached behind him, his hand finding Clara's, and laced his fingers through hers. Her eyes were shimmering with tears, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of overwhelming love and pride. He squeezed her hand, and together they turned and walked out of the church, leaving the man of God standing alone in the echoing, silent judgment of his own hypocrisy. They stepped out into the bright, clean sunlight, a united front, ready to face whatever came next, together. Their defiance of Reverend Miller bought them their solitude, but at a steep price, they became pariahs. In town, they were utterly ignored, served in stores with a stony silence. Their presence an unwelcome stain. But a far greater trial was descending upon the land, one that cared nothing for gossip or piety. The sky, which had once offered the life-giving promise of rain, turned to a sheet of hammered brass. The spring rains never came. Summer arrived with a scorching, relentless fury. The sun baked the earth until it cracked into a mosaic of dry, thirsty fissures. The creek that ran through their property slowed to a trickle, then vanished altogether, leaving a scar of bleached, sun-scorched stones. The drought was a slow, merciless plague. The grass in the pastures turned from brown to a brittle, lifeless yellow. The corn in the fields withered on the stalk, day after day. The wind blew, picking up the dry topsoil and swirling it into great, choking clouds of dust that blotted out the sun and coated everything in a layer of fine, red grit. One by one, their cattle began to sicken and die, their gaunt forms dotting the barren landscape. It was a time of grim, back-breaking labor with no reward. They worked from before dawn until long after dusk, digging deeper into the well for a few precious buckets of murky water, hauling it to the remaining livestock, their bodies aching and their hope dwindling with each passing, cloudless day. Many of their neighbors gave up, packing their meager belongings into wagons and heading east or west, defeated ghosts leaving behind their failed dreams. The relentless work and the crushing weight of despair took their toll on Silas. He grew leaner, the lines on his face deepening, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went bone deep. One evening, after spending the entire day trying to save a calf, he stumbled into the cabin, his face unnaturally pale. He swayed on his feet, mumbled something incoherent, and then collapsed to the floor in a dead faint. He awoke hours later in their bed, a fever raging through him. For the next 4 days, he was lost in a delirium of heat and chilling shivers. And through it all, Clara was a constant, unwavering presence. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned thin broth between his cracked lips, and sat by his side through the long, dark nights, her hand a cool, steady anchor on his feverish skin. Once again, she was the one beside him when he was at his weakest, but this time was different. There were no walls between them. Her care was not the dutiful act of a partner. It was the fierce, tender devotion of a wife who loved her husband. She watched him, her heart aching with a terrifying fear, and knew that this man, this land, this hard and unforgiving life was everything to her. If she lost him, she would lose the only home her soul had ever known. On the 5th day, his fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her face pale with exhaustion. He reached out a weak hand and touched her arm. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him looking at her, lucid and calm, a wave of such profound relief washed over her face that it brought a lump to his throat.
"Silas,"
she whispered, her voice thick with sleep and emotion. In the week that followed, as his strength slowly returned, a new depth of intimacy grew between them. He would watch her as she worked, overwhelmed by a love so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. She had saved him, not just from the fever, but from the 7 years of winter in his own heart. One clear, cool night, they sat together on the porch steps, wrapped in a shared blanket against the night's chill. The sky, free from the dust of the day, was a vast sweep of black velvet scattered with an impossible number of stars. For a long time, they sat in a comfortable silence, simply existing together in the great, quiet expanse of the plains. It was Clara who finally spoke, her voice soft in the darkness.
"Do you remember that night? The storm?"
"I remember," he said, his arm tightening around her. She hesitated, then plunged ahead.
"I think of it sometimes. And the other night, when I thought you were sleeping."
She trailed off, a faint blush rising on her cheeks, visible even in the dim starlight. Silas turned his head to look at her profile, at the clean line of her jaw and the gentle curve of her lips. He had replayed that night in his mind 1,000 times, the feel of her touch, the sound of her whisper, the ghost of her kiss. He knew this was the moment for the final, unvarnished truth.
"I wasn't sleeping, Clara,"
he said quietly. She went still beside him, and he could feel her heart begin to beat faster. He continued, his voice low and earnest.
I heard every word. I felt everything. And I lay there, telling myself it was a test, that I just needed to know how you felt." He paused, gathering his courage. "But that was a lie I told myself. The truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid to tell you what was in my own heart." She turned to face him, her eyes wide and shining in the starlight. "And what was that?" she whispered. He reached up and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her soft skin. "That night, lying there in the dark, listening to you, feeling you near me, that was the night I stopped just caring for you and knew I was falling in love with you." The word, *love*, hung in the air between them, bright and beautiful and terrifying. Clara's breath hitched, and a single tear traced a silver path down her cheek. "Oh, Silas," was all she could manage to say. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was not about passion, but about confession and absolute certainty. It was a seal on a vow that had been made in their hearts long ago. Their newfound peace was soon tested. A wagon appeared on the horizon, crawling slowly toward their homestead. It was the Miller family, the blacksmith from town. Their well had run dry 3 days prior. The man's face was a mask of desperation and shame. He had been one of the men who had openly shunned them. Now, he was at their mercy. "Blackwood," he said, his voice raspy, not meeting Silas's eyes. "My family, we've no water. The children—" Without a word, Silas took the man's water barrels and began to fill them from their own well, which, being deeper, still yielded a slow, steady supply. Clara, meanwhile, went into the cabin and came back with a loaf of bread, a slab of bacon, and a jar of preserves. She pressed them into Mrs. Miller's hands. The woman looked at her, her eyes filled with tears, and whispered, We don't deserve this, after how we treated you." "Hard times are for helping, not for judging," Clara said simply. The Millers' quiet gratitude was the first crack in the town's wall of hostility. Others followed. Families, desperate and humbled by the drought, began to see Silas and Clara not as sinners, but as neighbors, and good ones at that. They had stayed when others had fled. They shared what little they had when others hoarded, slowly, grudgingly. Respect began to replace prejudice. But the seeds of hatred planted by Reverend Miller had taken root in some corners. One moonless night, they were woken by the frantic barking of their dog. Silas grabbed his rifle and peered out the window. In the distance, he saw them, 3 flickering torches held by dark, cloaked figures, moving stealthily toward their barn. "Get dressed," he said to Clara, his voice grim. "They're here to burn us out." They rushed outside, Silas with his rifle, Clara with a heavy iron skillet, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. The figures were close now, about to touch their torches to the dry timber of the barn. Suddenly, a shout erupted from the darkness to their right. "Get away from there!" Silas and Clara spun around to see a group of men running toward them, not with torches, but with rifles and shovels. It was Miller, the blacksmith, and 6 other farmers from the surrounding homesteads. Their former tormentors had become their protectors. The arsonists, cowards at heart, dropped their torches and fled into the night. Miller walked up to Silas, his face set. "We heard what the Reverend was preaching to some of them," he said, gesturing to the fleeing figures. "That this drought was God's punishment for them letting you stay. That the land needed to be cleansed with fire. We've been keeping watch." He then turned and looked at Clara, his expression one of deep, hard-won respect. "This is her home. This is your home. No one is running you out." The confrontation seemed to break the back of the remaining hostility. A few weeks later, a traveling circuit judge passed through Redemption, and with him came news. An investigation in Massachusetts, prompted by a letter from a concerned parishioner, had uncovered Reverend Miller's past dealings It turned out he had accepted a significant donation from a wealthy merchant by the name of Elijah Cole. The timing of the donation, coinciding with his sudden transfer to the Wyoming territory, was highly suspect. Faced with disgrace, the Reverend had been quietly recalled and moved to a remote parish in the far north. Clara was, finally, and publicly, vindicated. With the drought's end and the arrival of the autumn rains, life began to return to the land. The grass grew green again, and the creek began to flow. The air felt clean, washed of both dust and hatred. One crisp, sunny afternoon, Silas and Clara stood on the small hill overlooking the creek, beneath the shade of the lone cottonwood tree where his first wife was buried. The Millers were there, standing as witnesses. Silas had picked a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers, a vibrant clutch of purple asters and yellow goldenrod, a callback to his first clumsy gift. He was not a man for fancy words, but the vows he spoke to Clara that day were more beautiful than any poetry. He spoke of gratitude, of respect, and of a love that had grown in the hardest of soils. Clara, in turn, spoke of finding a home not in a place, but in a person, of being saved not from hardship, but from shame. They exchanged simple, iron rings that the blacksmith had forged for them. It was not a grand ceremony. There was no organ music, no stained glass, no crowd of well-wishers. But as they stood there, hand in hand, with the wind whispering through the cottonwood leaves and the promise of a peaceful life stretching out before them, it was more perfect and more sacred than any cathedral service. A year passed. The land, as if rewarding their endurance, began to heal. The autumn rains had been gentle and steady, soaking deep into the thirsty earth. Winter brought a thick blanket of snow that melted slowly, replenishing the wells and the creek. Now, spring had returned with a vibrant, almost violent assertion of life. The pastures were a sea of lush green grass, studded with the brilliant colors of wildflowers. The fields, newly plowed and planted, held the dark, rich promise of a bountiful harvest. The farm was no longer just surviving. It was thriving, and so were they. The most profound change was not in the land, but within the walls of the small log cabin. It was in the easy silence that now filled the space, in the shared smiles and the casual, frequent touches, and it was in the gentle swell of Clara's belly, a visible, growing testament to their love and the new life they had forged together. One rainy afternoon in late spring, Clara sat in a rocking chair on the covered porch, a half-finished baby blanket of soft, knitted wool in her lap. The rain was not the violent, wind-driven assault of the storms she remembered, but a soft, steady drumming on the roof, a peaceful, life-giving sound. It washed the world clean, making the greens of the pasture seem impossibly bright, and filled the air with the sweet, clean scent of wet earth. Silas sat on the top step, his back against a post, his long legs stretched out before him. He wasn't working. He was simply watching his wife. He watched the way her fingers moved with a quiet, practiced grace, the way she would occasionally pause to look out at the rain, a small, serene smile touching her lips. That smile, once so rare and fleeting, was now a frequent visitor to her face. It was the smile of a woman who was content, who was safe, who was deeply and profoundly loved. Seeing it was, for Silas, a form of prayer. "It's hard to believe," Clara said softly, her gaze on the verdant fields, "that this is the same land that was all dust and despair a year ago." "The land remembers," Silas replied, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. "It just needs a reason to hope again. Just like people, I suppose." Their life had settled into a rhythm of peaceful, shared work and quiet affection. The town of redemption, humbled by the drought and ashamed by the Reverend's disgrace, had slowly, cautiously, welcomed them back into the fold. It began with a nod from the blacksmith, then a shy smile from his wife. Soon, others followed.
They were no longer the town's scandal. They were the Blackwoods, the couple who had weathered every storm, both literal and figurative, and had come out stronger. Their story had become a quiet legend, a testament to endurance and a rebuke to the petty judgments that had once seemed so important. One evening, while cleaning out an old trunk to make space for the baby's things, Clara came across a small, wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst some of Sarah's old keepsakes, were 2 letters. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized them. The first was written in a strong, masculine hand, the words stark and practical. Asterisk, I am a farmer, 35 years of age, a widower. I require a partner in work. She read it aloud, her voice soft. When she finished, she looked at Silas, who was watching her from across the room. A slow smile spread across his face. Not much of a poet, was I? He said, a self-deprecating chuckle in his voice. You were honest, she replied, her own lips curving. It was the honesty I trusted. She picked up the second letter, her own reply, the paper thin and fragile. The words were formal, clipped, a desperate attempt to maintain some dignity in the face of ruin. She remembered the woman she had been when she wrote it, frightened, alone, and utterly without hope. She handed it to Silas. He read it, his expression softening, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the box alongside his own. He came and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. 2 strangers, he said quietly, his gaze full of wonder. 2 lonely people writing letters in the dark, hoping for a bit of help. I never imagined I'd find this. He placed a hand gently on her swollen belly, a look of profound, reverent love on his face. I was just trying to save the farm. I had no idea I was saving myself. That night, long after Silas had fallen asleep, his steady breathing a comforting presence beside her, Clara lit a candle and opened her journal. It was a habit she had taken up, a way to capture the quiet, beautiful moments of this life she had never dared to dream of. She dipped her pen in the ink, the scratch of the nib the only sound in the peaceful cabin. Asterisk, October 2nd. Asterisk, she wrote. Asterisk, the rain fell all day, and the fields are so green it almost hurts the eyes. Silas sat with me on the porch for a full hour, doing nothing but watching the sky. I feel the baby move more and more now, a tiny, secret flutter that feels like hope itself. Tonight, we found the letters we first wrote to each other. It feels a lifetime ago. The man who wrote that letter, so guarded and full of grief, is not the man who sleeps beside me now, and the woman who answered him, so broken and afraid, is not the woman I am today. We have been remade by the land, by hardship, and by each other. She paused, staring into the flickering flame of the candle, her mind drifting back to another night, another silence. Asterisk, I find myself thinking often of that night, the night I truly believe our life together began, the night he pretended to sleep. I remember standing over him, my heart aching with such a terrible, helpless love. I thought he was lost in his own world of dreams and sorrow, and I was just a ghost passing through it. I confessed my unworthiness to a sleeping man. I stole a kiss from his lips, and I wept for a life I believed I could never have with him. How strange to know now that he was awake for all of it. He heard my foolish, whispered words. He felt my kiss. He knew. He was not testing me. He told me later he was simply a coward, afraid to speak his own heart. But in his silence, he gave me the space to speak mine. He was not sleeping. He was listening. He was waiting. That night, I thought I was confessing my love to the darkness. I now know I was whispering it directly into his heart. She closed the journal, a soft, peaceful smile on her face, and blew out the candle, plunging the room into the soft, familiar darkness. The following afternoon was warm and golden. They were sitting on the porch steps, Clara leaning back against Silas's chest as he braided a strand of her long, dark hair. His fingers,
usually so strong and capable with tools and reins, were surprisingly gentle. His touch was light on her shoulder when his hand brushed against her skin. He paused, his fingers tracing a small, faint line on her shoulder blade. It was a pale, silvery mark, a scar she'd had since childhood from a fall from a tree. For a long time, in the depths of her shame, she had thought of all her imperfections, both visible and invisible, as marks of her unworthiness. Silas leaned forward, his lips warm against her skin, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss directly onto the scar. Clara's breath hitched. It was an act of such profound and gentle acceptance, it made her eyes well with tears. "It's beautiful," he murmured against her skin. "It's a flaw," she whispered. He pulled back, turning her slightly so he could look into her eyes. His own were serious and full of a love that still, after all this time, had the power to take her breath away. "No," he said, his voice firm. "It's a part of you. It's a mark that says you lived, that you fell, and you got back up. It's the story of a survivor, and there is nothing more beautiful than that." He kissed her then, a kiss that healed the last, deepest wounds of her past, a kiss that promised a future where she would never again have to see herself as anything less than whole. The next Saturday, they undertook a new project. Silas had bought a dozen small saplings in town, cottonwoods, like the single, great tree that stood watch over Sarah's grave. Together, they spent the day planting them in a long, straight line along the western edge of their property, where they would one day grow tall and strong, a windbreak against the harsh, prevailing winds. They worked in an easy, companionable rhythm, digging the holes, settling the young trees, and watering them from the now full creek. "It'll take years before they're big enough to do any good," Clara said, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "That's the point," Silas replied, tamping the earth around the base of a sapling. "We're not planting them for us. We're planting them for those who come after." He straightened up and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "We're planting them for the generations that won't have to run from lies, a place where their roots can grow deep and strong, and no one can ever tear them up." As evening approached, they stood back, hand in hand, and admired their work. The line of small, hopeful trees stood as a testament to their faith in the future, a legacy of resilience and love. The sun began its slow descent, setting the horizon ablaze with brilliant color. The vast, empty sky that had once seemed so menacing was now a canvas of breathtaking beauty. The wind, no longer a mournful howl, whispered gently through the tall prairie grass, a sound like a soft, contented sigh. Clara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, her hand resting protectively on her belly. She watched the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, plunging the world into the soft, peaceful twilight. Everything was still. Everything was perfect. She turned her face up to his, and, in the deepening quiet, she gave voice to the truth that was the very foundation of her world. "If you had truly been asleep that night," she whispered, her voice full of wonder, "we might have missed a lifetime of love." Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories, and share your thoughts on Silas and Clara's journey.